Chapter 1. The Garden Party at Fernley Hall. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. It was the kind of afternoon the English countryside seemed specifically designed for. Clouds like whipped cream drifting lazily across a blue porcelain sky, and the scent of late summer roses mixing with fresh-cut grass. Fernley Hall, the stately yet slightly weather-worn manor on the edge of St. Mildred's, had thrown open its gates for the annual summer garden party, a tradition resumed with great enthusiasm after a brief hiatus due to Lady Redfern's nerves. Tables had been laid beneath cream-coloured awnings. Glasses clinked gently. The vicar had already eaten 2 slices of sponge cake and was eyeing a third with hopeful discretion, and Miss Jane Marple, comfortably seated near the edge of the festivities with her knitting resting in her lap, was precisely where she preferred to be, on the periphery, observing. The party was ostensibly in celebration of something vague and charitable, funds for the local school's roof, perhaps, or a commemorative bench for the late Colonel Hardwicke, whose legacy was more admired in death than in life. But no one minded the murkiness of the occasion. A good garden party required no real justification. Among the guests, notable figures from the village mingled in carefully practised casualness. There was Lady Redfern herself, fluttering about in pale green chiffon and pearls, greeting each guest with an anxious smile and speaking just a touch too loudly. Her son, Basil Redfern, had returned from London for the event, his city manners and slicked-back hair drawing more attention than he likely intended. Mrs. Grantley, the magistrate's wife, was in rapt conversation with Reverend Miles and his much younger wife, Cecily, who was wearing a bold hat and a bored expression. Mr. Archibald Grove, the retired solicitor who had a curious habit of vanishing during community events, only to reappear with a neatly folded newspaper, stood by the lemonade urn, polishing his spectacles with exaggerated care. And then there was Miss Evangeline Harper, newly arrived from London, and the object of much quiet speculation. She had taken the old Butterfield cottage at the edge of the village, a picturesque but rather draughty property, and brought with her an air of cosmopolitan mystery. No one knew precisely what she did in London, only that she dressed very well, spoke with a faintly American accent, and carried herself with the amused detachment of someone used to being noticed. She had also, on this particular afternoon, brought with her a crimson parasol. It was an eye-catching thing, bright as blood against the white lawn, incongruous and striking. Evangeline twirled it idly as she strolled along the garden path, casting flirtatious glances at Basil Redfern and exchanging brief, barbed compliments with Mrs. Grantley. Miss Marple, from her seat near the lavender border, watched the parasol with mild interest. "A most unseasonal colour," she remarked softly to Mrs. Weatherby, who was knitting beside her. "Quite," replied Mrs. Weatherby, "though I suppose it suits her. Dramatic sort, isn't she? They say she used to be on the stage." "They say so," Miss Marple murmured, though people often mistake confidence for theatricality. At precisely 3 o'clock, the string quartet began a hesitant rendition of Plaisir d'amour, and cucumber sandwiches circulated once more. The afternoon swelled with easy conversation, and gossip just pointed enough to sting without drawing blood. Then came the scream. It tore through the garden like a sudden gale, silencing music and movement alike. A sharp, high cry from the direction of the west garden near the rose trellises. Lady Redfern gasped. Someone dropped a glass. A hush fell so instantly it seemed the earth itself was listening. Reverend Miles hurried forward, his cassock flapping behind him, followed by Basil and several others. Miss Marple, neither flustered nor slow, rose to her feet and made her way, unhurried, unremarked, along the gravel path. They found her there. Miss Evangeline Harper lay crumpled beneath the rose trellis, her crimson parasol overturned beside her. Its vivid red had blended too easily with the crimson now soaking through the bodice of her dress. Miss Harper was quite dead. There was a moment of collective stillness before Basil said hoarsely, "Someone should send for the constable." Miss Marple did not speak. She merely looked down at the parasol and the way it had fallen. The lace edge curled up just so, the handle twisted toward the gravel path. Her eyes narrowed, not in shock, but in thought. The murder had come quietly, in the midst of music and murmured laughter, and yet already she knew someone had wanted it to be seen. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. By the time Constable Reeves arrived, a stout, red-faced man with a bicycle too small for his frame. The body had been respectfully covered with a picnic blanket, and the guests, rattled but clinging to propriety, had been herded back toward the tea tables by a trembling Lady Redfern. "This is awful, just awful," she murmured repeatedly, her fingers twisting a handkerchief that had once been embroidered with pink forget-me-nots. On my lawn, no less, in full view of the roses. Constable Reeves, to his credit, made a determined attempt at control. He took statements, cordoned off the trellis area with garden twine, and instructed everyone to remain on the property. This, naturally, was interpreted by the villagers as an invitation to form strategic huddles and engage in whispered debate, thinly veiled behind fans and parasols. "It's poison," declared Mrs. Grantley with authority, her eyes darting from person to person like a particularly suspicious owl. "Has to be. There wasn't a mark on her, and I heard from Cecily, who was quite nearby, you know, that she simply collapsed, just dropped. That's not stabbing, that's not shooting. Poison, plain and simple." "Nonsense," said Archibald Grove, who had emerged from somewhere near the wine-punch bowl with the air of a man expecting applause. "I happened to notice Miss Harper's face. Pure horror. That suggests a struggle, a sudden attack, most likely the heart, possibly a puncture wound." "A puncture wound in the heart," sniffed Mrs. Grantley. "What are you, a coroner?" "I was a solicitor," Grove said coldly, "which, I assure you, requires a considerable familiarity with causes of death." A few yards away, the vicar was speaking in low tones to Basil Redfern. "She was in conversation with you shortly before—" He hesitated. "Before the incident, was she not?" Basil looked pale. "Yes, just before." The music began. "She asked if I'd ever been to Monte Carlo. I told her no, I hadn't. And then she laughed." Basil frowned as if replaying the moment. "Said something odd. Some people bluff with cards, Mr. Redfern, but others bluff with lives. I thought it was just her being dramatic." Reverend Miles looked troubled. "A curious thing to say. Do you believe she felt threatened?" "By whom?" Basil muttered. "She held court here like a queen." Half the village hung on her every word. She didn't look afraid of anything. Miss Marple, seated once more near the edge of the lawn, observed this sea of half-truths and rising tension with the serenity of a woman sipping tea on a cloudy afternoon. Her eyes wandered, not to the most vocal guests, but to the quiet ones, the ones watching from the sidelines. There was Mrs. Danby, the Redferns' housekeeper of many years, wringing her hands at the edge of the terrace, not hysterical, simply anxious, as if she knew something but had yet to decide whether to speak it. There was Cecily Miles, younger than her peers, and plainly uncomfortable. She stood apart from the other wives, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze distant. And there, near the hedge, stood Dora Sims, seamstress and village listener, her ears sharper than any set of shears. She wasn't talking, which was notable. Dora always talked. Today she was watching. Miss Marple leaned slightly toward Mrs. Weatherby. "It's quite strange, isn't it?" she said softly, "how some people are frightened after a tragedy, and others simply regretful." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Regretful? Miss Marple said, her tone absent, her fingers idly twisting the yarn in her lap, as though they'd just realized something they'd hoped would never come to light. By the time the village doctor arrived to make a preliminary examination, the whispers had turned into theories, and the theories into near certainties. Mrs. Grantley was now convinced it was a jilted lover, likely from Miss Harper's mysterious London past. Archibald Grove insisted it was financial blackmail, and Lady Redfern, growing increasingly distraught, had declared the entire event cursed and was already speaking of cancelling the harvest fete. Through it all, Miss Marple said very little, but her eyes, mild and curious as ever, were keenly focused on a single detail none of the others had noticed: the parasol. It had fallen open beside Miss Harper's body, still intact, no sign of break or blood. And yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered seeing it closed only moments before the scream. A small detail, perhaps, but, as she often said to herself, it is in the smallest of things that human nature reveals its truest self. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. The next morning dawned grey and damp, as though the weather had decided to share in the village's shock. A steady drizzle pattered across rooftops and window panes, softening the edges of Fernley Hall and washing the garden paths clean of yesterday's chaos. But if the rain cleansed the lawn, it did nothing for the village's nerves. By 9 o'clock, the high street was already buzzing. The bakery queue was longer than usual, and the chemist's assistant had twice forgotten to wrap the ointment jars properly. Everyone, it seemed, had something to say about the garden party at Fernley Hall, and more importantly, about the murder that had turned a genteel occasion into village legend. At the centre of it all was Evangeline Harper's crimson parasol, now locked in a drawer at the constabulary with the rest of her effects. No weapon had been found, no witnesses had stepped forward, no motive had been confirmed, but the theories continued to bloom. Miss Marple, in her own quiet way, spent her morning not at the grocer's or in the bakery queue, but calling, politely and unannounced, on several acquaintances. Her first stop was at the vicarage, where Cecily Miles answered the door with a startled expression and a slightly flushed face. "Miss Marple, goodness, do come in. I'm afraid the vicar's out. He's visiting Mrs. Patchwell, you know, her lumbago. But I can offer you tea if you don't mind it strong." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Not at all, dear. Just a moment of your time, really. I thought it might be a comfort to see a friendly face after such a shocking afternoon." Cecily offered a tight smile as she poured the tea. Her hands trembled slightly. "It was horrible," she said, almost too quickly. "Miss Harper she wasn't the sort of person you'd expect to die, was she? Not like that." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Very lively, I thought. Rather like Mrs. Spaulding, who used to visit my cousin in Weston-super-Mare. Quite dazzling, always the centre of attention, and yet terribly lonely, as it turned out." Cecily's spoon clinked against her cup. "Lonely? Oh, yes. People like that often are, I find. They dazzle so brightly it hides the shadows underneath." There was a pause. Cecily looked down. At her lap, she was complicated. "Did you know her well?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as wool. Cecily hesitated. "Not well. She came to the vicarage once. Spoke to my husband about something. Charity work, I think she said. But she didn't really seem interested in church matters." "No," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "She seemed more interested in people, I thought. The way they behave, what they want." Cecily bit her lip. "She could be sharp. She once said something to me at the post office. I don't know if it was meant to be a compliment or, well, never mind." "Sometimes the most cutting remarks are made with a smile," Miss Marple murmured. Cecily gave a short laugh. Yes, that was exactly it. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Redfern Estate cottage, where Mrs. Danby, the housekeeper, was scrubbing a copper pot with more aggression than usual. "She came in through the side gate, you know," Mrs. Danby said after Miss Marple had eased the conversation gently toward the previous day's events. "Didn't like to use the front. Said it made her feel like a society matron." Pfft, that one knew how to make an entrance, but she didn't like to be watched leaving. How curious, Miss Marple mused. "Oh, she was full of peculiarities," Mrs. Danby continued. "Wouldn't let anyone else touch her things. That parasol she carried, red as anything, like blood. She cleaned it herself, wiped it down every evening with a cloth. I saw her do it through the kitchen window." "Did she now?" Miss Marple said. "That is particular. She always seemed careful," Mrs. Danby said slowly. "Cautious, as if she were waiting for something." "Or someone?" Miss Marple prompted. The housekeeper's eyes flicked up to meet hers. I wouldn't be surprised. By the time the sun had returned to cast golden rays over the rooftops of St. Mildred's, Miss Marple was seated once more in her parlour, knitting needles in hand, the fire hissing gently beside her. Her expression was thoughtful. Miss Harper had made herself the subject of village fascination, but her death, so dramatic and sudden, had all the markings of something deliberate. Someone had taken care. No weapon, no witnesses, no noise, but the scream. And yet Miss Marple knew that no murder was ever silent, not truly. People spoke before. They acted. In gestures, in glances, in silence too carefully maintained. And somewhere in the conversations of the day, subtle, hesitant, and so very English, someone had already betrayed more than they meant to. Chapter 4. First Suspects Miss Marple, and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol by Midweek, The inquest had been formally scheduled, and the village was brimming with the hushed urgency of people desperate to be helpful while hoping not to be implicated. Constable Reeves, who had never in his career handled a case more complex than a missing bicycle or the theft of rhubarb from the vicarage garden, found himself both overwhelmed and quietly thrilled by the gravity of the matter. With no immediate signs of violence and the body showing no obvious wounds, the coroner had declared the cause of death as suspicious and under examination, which, in the language of St. Mildred's, translated to definitely murder. The autopsy was pending results, but everyone had already drawn conclusions. "Must have been poison," Mrs. Grantley said again, this time to the butcher's wife, who, after much reflection, agreed it stood to reason, especially since Evangeline Harper's complexion had looked unnaturally flushed during the garden party. "A clear sign of cyanide," she said, though she had no idea what cyanide actually did. The talk turned inevitably to suspects, and all fingers pointed with surprising unity to Basil Redfern. "Well, he was seen talking to her just before it happened," murmured Dora Sims to Reverend Miles's housemaid, "and she did have that mysterious London air about her, the kind that knows things." "And she said that strange thing to him, didn't she?" the maid whispered. "About bluffing with lives? What was that?" "I'll tell you what it was," said Dora. "A warning, and he didn't take it kindly. That Basil had returned from London only recently, and that he had once been romantically linked with a woman older than himself, added fuel to the fire. It didn't help that he had no alibi for the moment of the murder. No one had seen him in the crucial window between the end of the string quartet's second piece and the scream that followed. The police, for their part, were treating him with interest. Miss Marple, of course, was not. "I've known Basil Redfern since he was a boy," she said mildly over tea at Mrs. Weatherby's. "He once lied about breaking a greenhouse window and turned himself in the next day from the guilt. Not the sort who carries secrets well." "But what about the quarrel?" asked Mrs. Weatherby. "You heard it too, didn't you? The bit about bluffing with lives?" "Oh, I heard it. But sometimes the things people say are far less revealing than the things they don't." Miss Marple sipped her tea and thought once more of Cecily Miles. She had been oddly still during that moment at the garden party, not in shock, but as if expecting something. Her posture, Miss Marple recalled, had been unnaturally rigid, her gaze fixed not on the rose trellis, but on Lady Redfern. And there was Lady Redfern herself, flitting from one guest to the next, flustered and fluttering, yet somehow always in the centre of attention. Her son was now the prime suspect, and yet she'd spent the day after the murder quietly requesting the removal of every photograph in the house that featured Evangeline Harper. That was not grief. That was fear. Then there was Mr. Archibald Grove, who had made a point of being seen, noticed even, though he had spoken to Evangeline only once, several days prior. He'd claimed to know nothing of her past, and yet he had dropped a curious remark at the garden party. Women like that rarely settle in a place like this unless they've already been everywhere else. Miss Marple recalled it distinctly, because he had said it just before the music started, and because Evangeline had turned sharply to look at him. She hadn't smiled. She had stared, as if she recognized him. That evening Miss Marple took out her notebook, not for evidence, but for pattern. She jotted names, circled events, dotted each interaction with the same attention she might give to a dropped stitch. Evangeline Harper had not been here long, but she had observed the village as acutely as any detective. She had spoken to many, flattered some, unsettled others. Someone had feared her enough to kill her. The police believed it was Basil Redfern, young, nervous, and easy to corner. But Miss Marple knew better. The real killer, she suspected, was far more experienced, someone who had survived not through innocence, but through silence. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue, Miss Marple, and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. The following morning, Miss Marple visited Constable Reeves under the pretext of delivering a jar of her famed blackberry conserve, a recipe she reserved for only the most deserving bachelors, as she put it. The constable, surprised and slightly pink about the ears, accepted the jar with awkward gratitude. "I thought," she said gently, "that you might allow me a glimpse of Miss Harper's effects. I shan't interfere, of course. Just a glance. I've always believed a woman's belongings say rather a lot, don't you think?" Reeves hesitated. "It's not exactly procedure, Miss Marple. No," she said kindly, "and murder is not exactly courteous. But I suppose we all must stretch a little when the situation calls for it." There was a pause. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he led her to the back room of the station, where the victim's belongings had been placed in a neat row upon a linen-draped table. The crimson parasol stood out among the muted tones, the only colour, the only object that still seemed to breathe. Miss Marple approached it first. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, she crouched slightly to peer beneath the canopy. A faint smudge caught her eye, brownish, near the tip of one rib. Not blood, something more like powder. "Did the doctor say whether she had any marks on her skin?" she asked without looking up. Reeves rubbed the back of his neck. "Said there was a small bruise on her upper arm. Not significant. Might have been from the fall." "Might have been," she repeated. She turned her attention next to the handbag. Leather, expensive but scuffed. The contents were mundane. A powder compact, a lipstick worn nearly to the base, 2 theatre ticket stubs, and a train receipt from Paddington dated 2 weeks before her arrival in St. Mildred's. And then a letter, folded once, torn along the top as if opened hastily. Miss Marple took one glance at the scrawled handwriting before passing it to Reeves. "I shouldn't read personal correspondence," she said primly. Reeves, however, did. His eyebrows rose. "It's unsigned. Says only, 'You'd best leave it alone, Ava. Some things are meant to stay buried.'" Miss Marple nodded, as though that confirmed a thought she'd already been turning over for some time. She leaned over the parasol, once more, this time examining the handle. A small brass catch, slightly ajar. "Ah," she said softly. "What is it?" Reeves asked. "Did anyone mention," she said almost to herself, "whether Miss Harper opened the parasol before she fell?" Reeves frowned. "Dunno. Most people said it was already open when they found her. But I remember," her eyes twinkled faintly, "that it was closed while she was walking earlier. She was spinning it like a cane. She could have opened it later." "Indeed she could have." Miss Marple stood upright, her tone mild. "Or someone else could have opened it after she fell." Reeves stared at her. "But why?" "To hide something, or to leave something," she replied. She gave the parasol one last glance and turned back toward the door. "Would you be terribly kind, Constable, and find out whether Miss Harper had any employment in London during the last year or so, and also if she ever performed on stage?" Reeves blinked. "Stage? She had an actor's grace," Miss Marple said, already halfway to the door. "And actors, in my experience, often leave behind a far more complicated script than the audience realizes." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Dora Sims in the latter's warm sitting room above the dress shop. The conversation drifted from rain to rose pruning to red fabric dye, which Dora noted was dreadful to remove once it sets, and yet, Miss Marple mused, "I always find that people choose colours rather deliberately, especially when it comes to appearances." Dora paused. "You mean Miss Harper?" "I do. Crimson is such a statement, don't you think? Eye-catching, almost theatrical." Dora nodded, the tip of her tongue pressed against her upper lip as she threaded a needle. She liked attention. "Or needed it," Miss Marple corrected gently. There was a long pause. Then Dora said, "Do you think she knew something?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said simply. "I think Miss Harper knew several things. The trouble is she told just enough of them." She folded her hands over her knitting bag. "And now we must find out who she was threatening to expose, or perhaps who she was trying to warn. Because that was the thing about a crimson parasol. It shielded not only from the sun, but from the truth." Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Miss Marple and the mystery of the crimson parasols a Thursday. The charm of village life had worn thin, replaced by an almost feverish atmosphere. Suspicion was no longer a whispered thing, but a palpable presence in every corner of St. Mildred's. Curtains twitched more frequently. Greetings were briefer. Conversations fractured when certain names were mentioned. It was not the presence of the constable or the coroner that unnerved people most. It was the sense that someone among them knew what had happened beneath the rose trellis and wasn't speaking. Miss Marple, of course, kept her usual rhythm. She paid her bills at the greengrocer's, walked daily to the post office, and spent time in quiet domesticity. Yet wherever she went, something always seemed to fall into place. Her first significant encounter of the day was with Archibald Grove, whom she found lurking in the rear pew of the empty parish church. "Mr. Grove," she said pleasantly, settling in beside him. "How very pious of you to be here so early." He smiled faintly, but his fingers fidgeted with the brim of his hat. "One finds peace in quiet places," he said, "and the village hasn't been quiet lately. Tragedy does tend to stir the still waters, I'm afraid," Miss Marple said, "although sometimes I wonder if the waters were ever still to begin with." There was a pause. "You knew Miss Harper from before," she said lightly. His head turned sharply. "What makes you say that?" "Oh, just a sense," she murmured. "The way you looked at her at the garden party. Recognition without surprise. And she, in turn, seemed less startled than displeased. I dare say you didn't part on the best of terms." Grove shifted uncomfortably. "She was complicated. They usually are," Miss Marple said kindly. He sighed. "We were engaged years ago, briefly. She called herself Ava Hart then. She was on the stage. Brilliant actress, especially when it came to lying." "And why did the engagement end?" She left, Grove said flatly. Took a purse of mine, too. Disappeared without a word. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And when you saw her again? I told myself I didn't care. But the truth is, I wanted an apology, or some explanation. She never offered either. And so you made a remark, Miss Marple said, her voice gently disapproving, about women who settle down after being everywhere else. He flushed. It was unkind, but not untrue. Miss Marple studied him. And when she died? Grove looked down at the floorboards. It was wrong, but it didn't surprise me. Later, that day, Miss Marple stopped in at the vicarage, ostensibly to return a hymn book, but in truth to speak again with Cecily Miles. The young wife looked as though she had slept poorly. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and she seemed distracted. "Do you believe in fate, Miss Marple?" she asked suddenly, without context. "Fate?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "That's a difficult question. I believe in patterns, in consequence, in the way people carry old wounds into new lives." Cecily looked away. "I sometimes wonder if we ever really escape the past." "Very rarely, dear. Especially when we try to pretend it never happened." There was silence for a moment. Then Cecily said, "She came here, you know, 2 nights before the garden party. She said she knew something about my husband." Miss Marple didn't react outwardly, though her knitting needles paused for half a breath. What sort of something? She wouldn't say. Cecily's voice trembled. Only that someone in the village had a secret, and that, if I valued my marriage, I ought to look closer at the kind of charities my husband supports. Miss Marple's gaze softened. That must have been a difficult thing to hear. Cecily stood suddenly. She was cruel, not just to me, to everyone. She enjoyed knowing things and holding them over people. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if she wasn't warning you." Cecily said nothing. She stood at the window, one hand pressed against the pane. Rain was beginning to fall again. She wanted something, she said. I don't know what. But she was pushing someone, and they pushed back. Miss Marple returned home through the drizzle, her thoughts swirling like the mist that curled through the hedgerows. So many little lies had surfaced this week. Old secrets. Fractures in the village's tidy surface. Grove had motive. Resentment. Betrayal. Cecily had fear. And Lady Redfern, though still maintaining her pose of distressed dignity, had gone suspiciously quiet since Basil became the focal point of gossip. That night, as the fire crackled and her knitting sat untouched in her lap, Miss Marple reviewed the strange chain of events once more. A parasol with residue, a bruise dismissed, a woman who had changed her name and perhaps returned to settle accounts, a warning note unsigned, and a village where silence had teeth. The killer, Miss Marple was now certain, hadn't planned chaos. They'd planned precision. But something, a parasol perhaps, had not behaved exactly as expected, and infected to it. That small misstep lay the path to truth. Chapter 7. Another Twist Miss Marple, and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. The next morning began with an unexpected knock at Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find Constable Reeves, damp from the rain, clutching a small brown envelope and wearing an expression equal parts confusion and concern. "I thought you'd want to see this, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside with visible hesitation. "Just arrived from London. Addressed to Miss Harper, but posted after her death." Miss Marple accepted the envelope without a word. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. She opened it carefully and withdrew a single sheet of crisp paper. "Eva, I waited like you asked. You promised me you'd speak first, that you'd do it carefully. And now I read in the papers that you're gone. I didn't want it to end this way. But if you forced my hand, know this. Someone in that village owes more than apologies. And I no longer intend to keep quiet. L. Who posted this?" she asked. Reeves shook his head. "Postmark says Charing Cross, 2 days ago. We've no clue who L is. Could be London, could be here. But it sounds like someone else knew what she was trying to do." Miss Marple read the letter again, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. "She wasn't bluffing," she murmured. Reeves looked puzzled. "Bluffing? Never mind," she said gently, folding the letter and slipping it into a small leather notebook. "Thank you for bringing it. I dare say this complicates things, but not in the way our killer might hope." At noon, news broke across the village that Basil Redfern had been formally questioned by the police again, though still not charged. A solicitor from London had arrived on the morning train, apparently engaged by Lady Redfern herself. This stirred the village into another flurry of gossip. But what caught Miss Marple's attention came not from the police, but from Mrs. Weatherby, who arrived at tea with a hushed tone and wide eyes. "You'll never guess," she whispered, setting her shawl aside, "what Cecily Miles has done." Miss Marple raised her brows politely. "She's gone to stay with her sister in Basingstoke. Left this morning, packed a case, left a note for the vicar, and went." "How sudden," Miss Marple said, pouring the tea. "Did she say why?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned in. The note said she needed a few days to think. "That's not just nerves, Jane. That's guilt. Something's not right there." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Cecily's departure was not surprising, but the timing was. "Judith was frightened," Miss Marple said at last, "and people don't flee unless they believe they're in danger, or worse, about to be blamed." By late afternoon, the village received its most astonishing development yet. The postmistress, Mrs. Garton, reported that a parcel had arrived nearly a week ago, addressed to Evangeline Harper, but never collected. Miss Marple, upon hearing this, asked Reeves to retrieve it. Inside the parcel was a small black velvet box, within the box a brooch. Not just any brooch, but a striking piece. Deep green emeralds arranged in the shape of a serpent coiled around. A ruby heart. Miss Marple examined it with great care. "She wore no jewellery at the party," she said softly to Reeves. "That's right," Reeves replied. "She was dressed simply. People noticed, actually. Seemed odd given her flair." Miss Marple nodded. "She was waiting to wear this." "But why didn't she collect it?" Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "Because she was afraid." She closed the box gently. "This isn't an accessory. It's a message, something only one other person would understand." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again by the fire, the brooch glinting softly in the lamplight beside her. She reached for her knitting, but found her thoughts too full. This new twist changed everything. It was no longer a matter of who hated Evangeline Harper enough to kill her. It was a matter of what she was about to reveal, and to whom, and most critically, who knew they were next. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test, Miss Marple, and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. The next morning was crisp and pale, with low fog clinging to the hedgerows, and a hush over the village that seemed to tremble with anticipation. In the small drawing-room of her neat whitewashed cottage, Miss Marple set out her best china and a modest sponge cake, barely sweetened. At precisely 10:30, Lady Redfern arrived. She swept in, as always, with carefully managed grace, hat just so, gloves impeccably matched, lips painted a diplomatic shade of rose. But Miss Marple noticed the tightness at the corners of her mouth and the faint tension in her gloved fingers as she accepted her tea. "I hope you don't mind my calling uninvited, Miss Marple," she began, voice low and controlled. "I wanted to thank you for your discretion. Basil tells me you've not joined in with the speculations." "Oh, I've never been one for speculating," Miss Marple said gently, slicing the cake. "I prefer observing. People are so much more truthful when they believe no one's listening." Lady Redfern smiled, though it was more habit than pleasure. "Quite." Miss Marple offered her a slice and watched as she barely touched it. Such a tragedy, poor Miss Harper. I dare say no one really knew her. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "and yet she seemed to know quite a few people." There was the faintest flicker behind Lady Redfern's eyes. "She brought a certain energy to the village," Miss Marple continued. "Remarkable how someone could arrive and within weeks understand so much." Lady Redfern set her teacup down. "I hope you're not suggesting she was interfering." "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied, "though I do believe she was preparing to confront someone about something they'd buried a long time ago." She reached for her knitting bag and drew out the black velvet box, placing it quietly between them. "She never wore this, you know. It arrived too late. Or perhaps she meant it to arrive after." Lady Redfern stared at the brooch. Her expression did not change, but her hands stiffened just for a moment before returning to her lap. "She told someone," Miss Marple said gently, "that she'd once been engaged, that it ended badly, but that she had moved on. She'd taken a new name, started a new life, and then fate brought her here. She never spoke to me about her past," Lady Redfern said quickly. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but she spoke to your son, and I believe she left something else, something not in a box. A final message hidden in that very dramatic parasol of hers." Lady Redfern looked up sharply. "A message?" "A powder," Miss Marple said quietly, "concealed in the lining of the parasol's tip. A trace of something faintly brown, unusual, possibly cosmetic, possibly more. She was careful. She cleaned it regularly, but she left it open that day, open and pointing toward the rose trellis. She knew someone would find her there." Lady Redfern's voice dropped. "What are you implying?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said with the lightest smile, "that Miss Harper knew someone might try to stop her, and that she meant to leave behind something, if they did." For a long moment Lady Redfern sat still. Her gaze was fixed not on Miss Marple, but on the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was brittle. She was cruel, Jane. She came here with that air of superiority, dredging up things. Long dead. I protected Basil. I always have. She saw that, and she enjoyed it. Miss Marple tilted her head. She wasn't threatening Basil. Lady Redfern blinked. What? She was warning him. About you. Silence. A log snapped in the fire. Lady Redfern stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. I think I must be going. I have an appointment. Miss Marple rose with her. Of course, thank you for calling. At the door, Lady Redfern paused, her hand trembling slightly on the handle. She didn't have to die. No, Miss Marple said softly, but she knew she might. Lady Redfern opened the door and stepped out into the pale morning light. She did not look back. Later that day, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the unopened brooch box resting beside her. Her test had worked, not because Lady Redfern confessed, but because she didn't. The absence of denial, the rigidity of posture, the trembling fingertips. Miss Marple had seen it before, in young wives who feared exposure, in men caught between duty and guilt, and in one rather ambitious maid who'd once tried to poison her employer's cat. Guilt had a very particular silence, and now it was time to assemble the village's players. The performance, Miss Marple knew, was nearly over, but the curtain had not yet fallen. Chapter 9. The Reveal Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. The drawing-room of the vicarage was chosen for the occasion, not too grand, yet sufficiently respectable, with high windows and a calming view of the rain-dappled lawn beyond. Reverend Miles had agreed, albeit with slight discomfort, to host the gathering. Better that than whispering in every doorway, he had said, adjusting his collar for the third time. Miss Marple had requested the presence of a few key individuals, and now, as the clock struck 4:30, they assembled with the careful wariness of people who suspected far more than they were willing to admit. Lady Redfern sat stiffly on the settee, hands folded in her lap, face carefully composed. Basil Redfern, seated beside her, looked weary and confused, his eyes darting from person to person. Archibald Grove stood near the hearth, arms crossed, as though bracing himself for attack. Constable Reeves occupied a chair by the door, notebook in hand but unscribbled. And Cecily Miles, freshly returned from Basingstoke, and noticeably pale, hovered near the window, eyes downcast. Miss Marple entered last, her knitting bag tucked primly under one arm, her manner cheerful, almost grandmotherly. "Thank you all for coming," she said pleasantly. "I know this hasn't been an easy week for any of us, but I believe it's time we spoke plainly. It's so very tiring, pretending not to know what we already suspect." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Miss Marple took a seat and folded her hands in her lap. "Miss Harper," she began, or Eva Hart, as she once was, came to St. Mildred's not to hide, but to reveal. She had discovered something about someone here, and she gave that person every chance to come forward. Her gaze drifted to Archibald Grove. "You knew her from before. You were once engaged. She left you, yes, but not without reason. She later discovered things about your past dealings, financial ones, misuse of funds during your tenure as a solicitor. The kind of thing that might not have made headlines, but would certainly have ended your reputation. Grove's mouth tightened, but she didn't expose you, Miss Marple continued. She merely let you know she could. Then she turned to Cecily Miles. You were the only person Miss Harper visited in private. You told me she was cruel, but I suspect what frightened you was not what she said, but how accurate it was. She knew your husband's charitable activities had diverted funds, perhaps unknowingly, to causes of questionable repute. She offered you a warning, not a threat, and when you fled, it was from fear of scandal, not guilt. Cecily's eyes shimmered with tears, but she said nothing. Then Miss Marple's gaze fell upon Lady Redfern. She knew the most about you. Lady Redfern's chin lifted. I have nothing to— Oh, but you do, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Years ago, when Basil was still a boy, you hired a governess, one Miss Eva Hart. You dismissed her under unpleasant circumstances. A silence fell over the room. She had learned that your late husband had involved himself in a fraudulent business venture, not unlike Mr. Grove's, and you, Lady Redfern, paid handsomely to ensure her silence. But Ava never forgot. And when she arrived at Fernley Hall again, years later, this time under a new name, she did so not for revenge, but for closure. She wanted the truth to be spoken. Basil turned sharply to his mother. Is this true? Lady Redfern said nothing. Miss Marple continued softly. She brought with her a brooch, a very specific one, symbolic really, the serpent around a heart. She intended to wear it at the garden party, but she never did. I believe it was meant as a signal, a final flourish to draw the truth into light. She leaned forward. But you couldn't allow that, Lady Redfern. You were cornered. Her presence, her hints, her knowing glances, it was all too much. So you acted. During the string quartet's second piece, when eyes were on the musicians and your son had wandered, to fetch lemonade, you approached Miss Harper near the rose trellis. You argued. She turned away. And you, so elegant, so practised, slipped the poison under her skin. Gasp! She was bruised on the upper arm. Not from falling, but from a sharp jab. Perhaps a hatpin, perhaps the tip of a concealed syringe. Either way, the method was clever, clean. And the parasol? You opened it afterwards to create the illusion she'd fallen mid-stroll. But you made one mistake. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and withdrew a folded handkerchief. This, a residue taken from the parasol's frame, a compound rarely used now, once common in stage productions for simulating fainting fits. A neurotoxin, absorbed quickly and easy to conceal. Lady Redfern's face had gone utterly pale. I didn't mean to kill her, she said at last. Her voice was barely a whisper. I just wanted to frighten her, to make her stop. Miss Marple nodded gently. But some truths won't stay buried, Lady Redfern, especially when they're owed. As the constable led Lady Redfern from the vicarage, Basil remained seated, stunned and still. Cecily wept silently into a handkerchief. Grove had turned his back to the fire, his face unreadable. Miss Marple rose quietly, smoothing her skirt. I find, she said to no one in particular, that people are so very good at pretending until they aren't. And with that she stepped out into the late afternoon, the scent of damp roses curling in the air like the memory of something once lovely, and now lost. Chapter 10. Aftermath. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Crimson Parasol. It rained the next morning, a soft, steady drizzle that turned the village roads to slick cobblestone and blurred the lines between the garden flowers and the grey skies above. Fernley Hall stood quiet, its windows shuttered, the echoes of the garden party long extinguished. Lady Redfern was no longer there. Her confession, half spoken, half inferred, had been enough for the authorities to act. Constable Reeves, with quiet reluctance, had made the necessary arrangements. There would be a formal investigation, naturally, and solicitors would be summoned. But the core of it was undeniable. The truth, long suppressed beneath layers of social performance and propriety, had finally surfaced. Basil Redfern had left the village early that morning, bound for London. He had not spoken much after his mother's arrest, save for a brief visit to Miss Marple, during which he expressed shame, confusion, and a kind of childlike sadness that made him appear younger than his years. "She wanted to protect me," he had said, "even from things I didn't need protecting from." "Yes," Miss Marple had replied softly, "but protection can become possession if it's not tempered by truth." He'd nodded, then thanked her, not just for the solution, but for her kindness. Elsewhere in the village, the mood had shifted from feverish curiosity to hushed reflection. The gossips were quieter now, their certainty replaced by something nearer to humility. Evangeline Harper, Eva Hart, was spoken of with a mixture of fascination and guilt, as though her role in the village had only become clear in death. At the vicarage, Cecily Miles moved more freely now, her face less pinched, her voice stronger. She had sent a letter to her sister asking her to visit soon, and Miss Marple had observed with satisfaction the way the vicar had begun taking longer walks, often accompanied by his wife. Archibald Grove, for his part, had retreated into something like exile. His name was not cleared precisely, but his sins were of a quieter variety, the sort the village would eventually absorb and forget, as it always did when it suited. And as for Miss Marple, she returned to her garden, tending to the dahlias, which had been neglected for several days. She sat once more at her parlour window with her knitting, watching the life of the village resume its gentle rhythm. But not unchanged. There was something always left behind after such a storm, like the faint scent of rain on stone or the imprint of a shoe in softened earth. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a small parcel in the post, no return address. Inside was a brooch, the coiled emerald serpent with the ruby heart, tucked into black velvet. There was a single card enclosed. You saw what others would not. She would have liked that. Miss Marple turned the brooch over. In her hands, her eyes thoughtful. No signature, no need for one. Eva Hart, flamboyant, flawed, and fiercely unafraid, had sought not vengeance, but acknowledgment. She had written her final act with careful precision, and in Miss Marple she had chosen the right audience. Later that evening, over tea with Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple remarked, "You know, people often speak of murder as something rare and shocking, but in my experience it's rather like mildew, hidden in corners, fed by secrets, and far more common than one would like to think." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. Such a dreadful metaphor, Jane. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, but dreadfully apt. And with that, she poured the tea, the past slipping back into memory. Quiet, resolved, and just a touch crimson at the edges.